Thank you to Marion and above all to Victor Zhou for giving us such an excellent foundation to build on regarding health technology and health crises. It's been a pleasure to listen to that, and I'm delighted to be in charge of our first panel debate. And thank you very much for joining us. As you know from the programme, the title for this session is Health Assets in the Next Crisis, Who Owns the Technology? So why did we choose this theme? Well, simply put, in recent months, widely divergent views have emerged regarding how data, IP, therapeutics and new technologies should be shared between countries, between agencies, across sectors when a health emergency arises, which in turn raises a key question. When the future emergencies are upon us, which R&D and technology blueprint will the world choose? And so to go deeper into this question, I'm delighted to welcome an excellent group of speakers who've kindly agreed to join this panel debate. So in alphabetical order, I'm very happy to introduce Rachel Chikwamba, the Group Executive for Chemical, Food, Agriculture and Health at the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research in South Africa. Amy Dietterich, who is the Director of Global Challenges at the World Intellectual Property Organization. Lars Fogh Iversen, Senior Vice President for Global Research Technologies at Novo Nordisk, and last but by no means least, Robert Jan Smits, President of the Executive Board at the Eindhoven University of Technology in the Netherlands. So a very warm welcome to you all. Thank you for joining us today. Before we get going, I also just want to remind our audience that if you have specific questions for any of the panel during this session, we will do our best to get to them, but please don't hesitate to put them into the live Q&A on the EventShare platform, and we will do our best to address them live during the session. So let's get straight to the discussion. And to get things going, I've asked our panels to reflect and maybe to take 2 minutes maximum to answer a cross-cutting question, which is the following. In your view, what is the most profound change that COVID has made to the world of health, research and technology development? So to keep things simple, let's go in alphabetical order. Rachel, let's hear from you first.
Thank you very much. I think COVID-19 has really shone a light on the vital nature of research and development in everything from actually surveillance, disease surveillance, decision support through modeling and trying to predict when the disease and hotspots are going to pop up, issues of product development and manufacturing, and the vitality of a total systems view if we are to combat the epidemic. I think what also has become quite clear is that what we call expenditure, at least what we called expenditure until now in health research and development, has now changed and is now being viewed as an investment into something of existential importance for humankind. So suddenly, as a researcher, I'm quite happy that now the importance of what it is that we do as scientists is now being put at the level where it should be put at. And ultimately, in countries like South Africa and others, I think what has been laid bare is that there is this deep chasm between the very good science that we do, the early stage R&D that we do, we publish good papers, we collaborate in that space, and we collaborate on the other extreme on clinical trials and clinical development of products from elsewhere. But that translational bit in our own country that's supposed to facilitate the pull through of the concepts that come out of the early stage R&D right through to product development, manufacture, past those clinical trial fields that we're so very good at participating in. That chasm has been made very, very clear. And when we talk about future strategic capability, that's where I want to focus. So thank you for the opportunity.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Rachel. Amy, let's pass to you next. How's the world changed in the most significant way for you in health tech and R&D? Amy, we think we have you on mute, actually, so if you could just put your speaker on. Thank you.
I had me on mute. Thanks, Simon. And I just wanted to say, first of all, Rachel, I absolutely loved your responses. I feel like they're spot on. And to those, I would add, urgency. I think in all of our lifetimes, we have never seen a global health issue that is as urgent as COVID-19 is. And this is a little bit of an I told you so moment for those of us who are global health advocates, because for a very long time we have said there's such an intimate connection between infectious diseases and health and the economy and the global economy. And so much so that we've had to almost put price tags on diseases saying, look, if we solved malaria, look at how much money all these economies would save. And one of the things COVID-19 has done is it has made that connection so apparent. So I would say that that's actually a good thing that has come out of COVID-19, is that finally the global health advocates have had their I told you so moment in terms of the connection between health and the economy. And Simon, I just wanted to point out that when you opened up the panel, your main question was, so when the next health emergency is upon us, you know, what is going to be the situation? And I would actually say the next health emergency is already upon us, and it's actually the climate change crisis. For me, you cannot decouple health and climate change, and that's like a main thread that I think will continue through my comments. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Amy. I'm sure we will be coming back to that a little later. As you say, it really is a red thread throughout these discussions today. So let's move to Lars Fogh Iversen. Lars, you're running global research technologies at Novo Nordisk, not specifically part of the vaccine development journey, but you must be watching this as a leading health technology company and thinking about what this implies for the future of your R&D and the company's role in different health systems around the world. So the floor's yours.
Absolutely, thank you. I mean, I can only echo what Amy and Rachel have already highlighted as key eye-openers for us. But being and trained as a research scientist, I've just been amazed about how we could accelerate innovation, sort of from the bench to the bedside of our patients, and that has been amazing to see what can actually be achieved when we put the resources behind it, both politically and financially. And then to throw one more thing into the bucket here on top of what Rachel and Amy also put in, is for me sort of highlighting some of the things that we are already struggling with in health, namely chronic disease. We see that a lot of the people suffering from chronic diseases are actually the most vulnerable patients, also when we have a pandemic. And I mean, needless to say, then you know that people with diabetes, suffering from diabetes, obesity, and so on, have a higher risk of hospitalization and death when they're infected with COVID-19. So for me, it's highlighting some of the other burdens that we are struggling with. So just to put it on top of climate changes, we also see that the pandemic highlights the shortcomings in treating chronic diseases. And that was really a profound reflection from my side. What can we do more to also help these patients that are truly vulnerable?
Excellent. Thank you very much. We're going to be coming back to that for sure a little later on. Last but not least, Robert Jan Smits. Robert, you spent many years on the science policy side of things. Now you're chair of one of the leading universities for science and technology in Europe, if not the world. So what have you taken away from the last 18 months?
Well, I think there's little to add after the comments made earlier on. I think there are two messages which I would like to mention. I think, first of all, the power of research, but notably of basic research, because we should not forget that the research on messenger RNA started 30 years ago by the Hungarian biochemist Katalin Karikó. So in other words, it shows the power of basic research, and that we should never forget that. And that is the first lesson I would indeed draw from the crisis. Let's continue funding, supporting basic research. Secondly, it is for me a confirmation of the power of international cooperation, of sharing data, of sharing publications and working together. And that is, I think, one of the lessons I also take home from the COVID-19 crisis. If we join forces, we can do miracles together. And let's now also join forces on some of the other ground societal challenges we are facing. Amy mentioned already climate change, the energy transition, but there are many, many more. So the power of international cooperation was underlined once again in the COVID-19 crisis.
Terrific. Thank you, Robert Jan. And I'm very glad that you brought up this question of data sharing and data ownership, because that's a segue into our first more specific theme in this panel discussion, which is going to be around IP and data. And I'm going to come to Amy first, because As we know, there's been a lot of hotly contested views expressed in recent months about the particular ownership models of IP and data. But there's a parallel question about whether or not this is kind of a distraction from more pressing concerns, and whether or not this is really where the question about how we prepare competitively or cooperatively for future health emergencies should focus. So Amy, what's your take on this?
Thanks, Simon. So first of all, as a staff member of the World Intellectual Property Organization, it's not my place to comment on member state negotiations that are going on in WTO right now. So I'm going to leave that aside and just say that the global IP system generates such a massive amount of data. And there's a lot of really good news there, because one of the roles of my agency of WIPO is to make that data fully available to the general public, to our fellow agencies, to researchers everywhere. Some of you may be familiar with PatentScope, which is actually a database of over 100 million patents. And what's so interesting about that is, when you file for a patent, there's kind of this social bargain. So in exchange for the patent, you actually have to disclose information about the innovation. You have to make that patent document publicly available, which means that there is just this massive, massive lake of data that WIPO has, and others have it as well. And one of our main roles is to actually make that data available, and then to add layers, value-added layers, including analysis, including putting in search terms so that you could type in. So for example, if you go to PatentScope today and you type in respirator, it will pull up all of the patents that are related to respirator technology, and you can even put in various COVID-19 search terms, and it will pull that up with the express purpose of helping people, helping scientists, helping researchers, helping policymakers to actually harness this huge IP data lake that is there. And that's one of the main roles. And for me, that's the fascinating link between IP and the UN, because not a lot of people know that the World Intellectual Property Organization is actually part of the UN. We are a UN specialized agency, which means we are mandated to support the Sustainable Development Goals, which means that we are harnessing this tremendous amount of data for global good. We are doing patent landscapes, for example. That's a very powerful tool where you have people who spend sometimes months and months and months searching through these patent collections that, for example, would be related to COVID-19 technologies. They digest all this information, they publish a report, and it's fascinating because it's almost like an insight into what could soon come onto the market. So what's coming out of the research laboratories and is hopefully potentially on its way to the market. And I know that is a way of describing the role of the patent system in a way that not a lot of people are used to hearing, because of course, since the COVID-19 emergency started, there has been this, interestingly, a very negative painting of the IP system, and as Lars mentioned earlier, a lot of this COVID-19 vaccine technology, especially that's based on mRNA, is based on research that started happening 30 years ago. And how did that research accumulate? Well, a lot of it was patented and licensed from one university to another, and then from the universities to the companies. And that's exactly how that's supposed to work. That's exactly how the global IP system is supposed to work in that instance.
Hear what the others think about this, because again, I think from the WIPO perspective, the IP system's been functioning pretty well, but there are parts of it that aren't perhaps as well known to the scientific and policymaking communities as it should be, perhaps. But to the rest of the panel, do you think the IP system has been working as intended in the last 18-24 months, or are there areas that really need to be strengthened and improved? Has it been a systemic asset or a systemic problem? Who would like to address this first? Lars, let's come to you.
Yeah, and probably you know what I'm going to say coming from the industrial part, but I think the patent system is a cornerstone for us actually sharing data, invention, research, and I think Amy put it out quite right, that without the patent system, a global patent system, then we would not have accelerated these inventions as we have seen over the past 18 months. And so for me, it's really foundational for what have happened under the pandemic, trying to accelerate these innovations. And I think I have really admired what have happened between the academicians, the biotechs, and the pharma companies and the manufacturers, how they have actually been working together. And we can count more than 300 collaborations worldwide to combat this pandemic. That just is, for me, is a statement about how well it is working and how well people are actually seeking voluntary collaboration. So for me, it's foundational, it's a cornerstone, not only for this health crisis, but for also forthcoming health crises.
Terrific, thank you. Robert Jan, let's come to you next. I mean, you're the sort of the forefather or the godfather of Plan S when you're at the European Commission. Do you think access and data sharing is a systemic problem?
Well, it is absolutely. I mean, we have had centuries where the results of publicly funded research, the scientific publications were locked behind paywalls. And the open access movement is putting an end to that, thank God. And let's now make sure that we don't make the same mistake with regards to scientific data which are generated by the public purse, so they don't end up behind paywalls. I think certainly in this crisis, you saw that the public-private partnership worked extremely well. We'll come probably back to that later on. I think Lars already mentioned it. I think everyone took his responsibility. The big pharma companies, the small pharma companies, the public sector, NGOs, and they all worked together. And the fact indeed that there were something like 300 voluntary licenses concluded on manufacturing, distribution, including technology transfer, shows that also the big pharmaceutical industries took their responsibility. I think if they would not have done this, then it would have been an end to the IP system as we know it in the past. But I think everyone in this crisis took its responsibility. And therefore, I hope that we can do a similar thing, not just when there are crises, but when we need to tackle some of the other ground societal challenges, as we mentioned, like climate change. So let's do this, putting together, sharing data, giving voluntary licenses. Let's not only do these type of things when there's a crisis. Let's make that the new normal.
Excellent. Rachel, let's hear from you. I mean, CSIR is working at the interface, not just between the scientific and industrial communities in South Africa, but South Africa to the rest of the continent and the world. So give us your perspectives on this.
Thank you, Simon. And I will add on to what has been said, starting with something that Amy has said. And I think that the patent system obviously is a place that we as scientists go to find out where the leading edge in any technology that we're trying to develop is at. And in fact, it helps us to know who to negotiate with for what. And not to say that the negotiations are always easy, but certainly you know where that leading edge is at. You also understand that if you want to innovate, what is the nature of the landscape around which you need to maneuver? So to that end, it is extremely helpful to understand that. Now, from a perspective of we need to make products and to make them in a hurry and to make them accessible to all parts of the world. This is where I think the conversation that we're having now with Robert Jan around, can this be the new normal, then comes into play, because we have seen some of the walls come down with respect to the data having been behind those walls, and also some of the barriers lowering, where we used to perceive patents that are held by big pharma as a major barrier to access to final product. We're beginning to see that if it is in fact a matter of existential crisis for humanity, those barriers can come down, and it is manifest in the 300 voluntary collaborations that we have seen happen. The question, as Robert Jan rightly puts, is, does this then become the new normal? Or if this crisis goes back the walls go back up again. Clearly, there is the finer detail that is being negotiated, and Amy made reference to this, the WTO that is being discussed to say, what does that mean for this pandemic and for future epidemics and pandemics? And in fact, when you think about it and thinking back to something that I think Lars said, that there is this pandemic in the form of COVID, but there is the chronic disease that is embedded in there, that is growing in itself, that is really also reaching in some places crisis proportions. So the question then becomes, and this is, I think, where the litmus test will be, will we start to think about access to, therapeutics for chronic disease in the manner, and cooperate in the manner in which we have thought about access and cooperation with COVID? Because when you then look at the numbers of people who actually die from chronic conditions, it's huge. And yet we have not given this the same agency and the same, we don't have as much of a burning platform as COVID has given us. So can this be, to Robert Young's words, the new normal? And I think that is something that we're still working through.
Very good. Well, that's also a nice way to segue into our second topic, which is really around capacity building and tech transfer. Victor Zhao earlier this morning, morning for him, afternoon for us, referred to building on Act A, trying to create a kind of international platform for tech transfer, along with global health funds and other kinds of cross-border partnerships to move this forward. But the critical importance of tech absorption capacity in health systems was another point that he made, including production and distribution. So actually, Rachel, if I can just stay with you for a moment, what does strategic capability look like for you in South Africa? I mean, through the COVID response and then also beyond.
Very good. Thank you for asking that question, because it is a vital one. And I want to start by picking up where the conversation was at with, I don't recall if it was Lars who spoke about, I think actually it was Robert Young, the fundamental importance of basic R&D that we have done until now, that has allowed us in South Africa, for example, to have sequencing capabilities that allow us now to track the epidemic as it rolls out, to look for strains that might be more harmful than the strains that we're used to, and so on. So there is that emphasis on, we need that basic science pillar and the modeling associated with it to remain important. So much as these were people who were considered gene jockeys, looking at things that are perhaps a little bit far removed from the crisis of a developing country, suddenly these are the people that we're looking to now for basic decision support with respect to what happens next in the rollout of the pandemic, but also in the strategic response that government then puts into place. Now, I spoke earlier on about a chasm that we see in South Africa and other countries, and the importance of absorptive capacity is the context of your question. So you will see that now there have been quite a few announcements of the ability to actually mostly break down bulk drug substance that's received from elsewhere in developing countries at particular hubs. These hubs had certain basic capabilities that allowed them to become hubs, mostly at the extreme end of breaking down drug substance into smaller doses, finishing, polishing, and distributing. We have already spoken about the strategic capability in fundamental research. And then the missing middle for me is that translational research work of taking concepts through really very early stage preclinical proofs of concepts, and then saying, how do we start to scale that up, developing cGMP manufacturing for preclinical and clinical lots, and then obviously going into manufacturing and distribution. For me, that chasm is one that we need to address. And in fact, you hear a lot now around, much as the immediate responses that have spoken to allowing us to receive bulk drug substance for distribution is an extremely welcome intervention. There is a lot of talk around how do we plug that gap so that we've got some strategic and sovereign abilities along the full value chain.
Great. Now, Rachel, if I can, I'm just going to pause you there because I'd like to bring in Lars and get a sort of, maybe a contrasting, maybe an aligned perspective on this. I mean, Lars, Novo Nordisk is plugged into global health value chains in a number of different condition areas, right? Is this reality that Rachel's describing, the gaps in emerging developing markets around the translational research, something that you also see from a corporate perspective? I mean, what does this sort of health tech value chain landscape look like for you going forward, also with these questions of tech transfer and capacity building?
Yeah, it's a super relevant question, and I think that the pandemic have really imposed some changes to us also. I think for me, there's not been a translational problem with progressing the vaccines. As I said earlier on, it's actually really gone fast compared to other pharmaceuticals. I can talk for hours about translational problems in chronic diseases, where we're not discussing months, but really years and sometimes decades. So when it comes to this particular pandemic, I think the translational parts going all the way from preclinical to actually approval has been amazingly fast. So I don't see that as a major thing that have happened, or a major thing that should change. I actually take it as a source of inspiration, because we see also now that we are changing ways of operating to go into decentralized clinical trials and the like to speed up what we are doing. So I see it in a very positive light. Maybe I'm a chronic optimist here, but I really see that we will see an acceleration of translation from non-communicable diseases to communicable diseases, because it has forced us to digitize a big part of our value chain that I think we will benefit from whenever we want to go in and do new developments and clinical trials. So in the translational part, I actually think this has been a great source of inspiration, but rather than a big source of problems.
Great. Okay, well, let's build on that, and I'm going to ask Amy something about the health systems perspective, because in your previous life before WIPO, you spent an awful lot of time with UN agencies and other parties on health system capacity building. And we heard also from Victor Zhao this morning about the radical importance of flexibility and agility and the speed with which health systems are able to respond to emerging threats. So what do you think is the way forward? Is a regional, national, autonomous model more appropriate, or do we need to be investing a lot more in thinking about global health system capacity building, or somewhere in between? What would be your response?
Thanks, Simon. Yeah, and as you mentioned, this is tapping into my previous experience. I mean, I think we need to remember what each part of the system does. So when we're talking about the international level, when we're talking about the global level, we have to remember that that's mainly policy. It's laying the rails, it's agreeing on things, but it's not the actual implementations. It's not the actual doers. It's not the actual getting their hands dirty. I think we could have the most beautiful framework that is created at the international level, but if the countries and the regions themselves aren't ready to actually translate that framework to and whether it's providing the tech transfer or receiving the tech transfer. And I would say in most cases, it's receiving the tech transfer. If you don't have the country level systems in place, and I don't know how much our viewers have the health systems building blocks memorized, but it's, you've got finance at the country level, you've got the health workforce at the country level, you've got infrastructure in terms of hospitals, you've got, if all of that is not in place, then we can have the most perfect international level. But if the national level is missing, then it's just not going to take root and it's not going to flourish. So, that would really be my main message, especially now that I work so much at the international level. It's don't ever forget the national and the regional. Don't ever stop looking at what is the actual capacity and the readiness level to receive in the recipient countries and regions where we're looking to increase this capacity.
Great, thank you very much, Amy. So Robert Jan, to you next. So as the head of, again, a leading science and technology institution based here in Europe, but also highly experienced in the international R&D policy space, where do you think international cooperation needs to begin? Is it around the basic research that you spoke of earlier? Is it about building capacity at a regional, national level, finding the right kind of partners on tech development and commercialization? What do you talk about in the Eindhoven faculty room when you think about this?
Well, it's not a matter of and or, it's more a matter of and. I think everyone is now realizing, and Rachel already mentioned it, is that the COVID-19 crisis is only over when it's over in all parts of the world. And that proves once again that we need to really work on capacity building in developing countries. It's obvious. And not just develop the products and the vaccinations and the vaccines in one part of the world and then roll it out and sell it. No, there needs to be capacity building activities taking place. And there I must say that I'm quite impressed by the work of the European Commission. Rachel knows quite well EDTCP, the clinical trials platform for poverty-related diseases, HIV, malaria, tuberculosis, which is a great initiative, a partnership with African countries, and South Africa is one of the leaders to really make sure that capacity building takes place. So, Simon, it's not a matter of just saying, okay, we need to do more on basic research, we need to do more on no, we have to really have an agenda where we are taking care of all the parts which are important to avoid such things from happening again. And I remember quite well the Ebola crisis, and where everyone started only moving in helping developing countries to set up capacity building when then the disease spreads to other parts of the world. Then suddenly it was a wake-up call. Oh, we need to make sure that in the African countries most concerned, we capacity building. So it's not a matter of and or, as I'm saying, it's a matter of and. We have to have a really integrated agenda which has different components. But I would like to underline once again, besides capacity building, this fundamental research is basic research, because again, messenger RNA was really the work of a few very important and impressive scientists who started 30 years ago, and we are now very grateful to them for having started that work.
Quite so. Thank you to all for those answers. So let's move on to our next topic, which is around crisis management, R&D blueprints and governance. I think as we all appreciate, as Dr. Zhao underlined this morning, there's been an unprecedented level of cooperation between policymakers, industry, science, funding agencies, regulators, this entire global health community mobilizing in response to the pandemic. But it's also brought an awful lot of political attention on healthcare governance and delivery. And so let's come to Lars first. Lars, putting on your sort of sector hat, do you think we're entering an age of a new blueprint for R&D governance and technology management in healthcare?
Yes and no. Let me try to elaborate. I spoke to what I think really worked well was the acceleration of innovations from the bench to the bedside. And I think that we have a blueprint there with the IP as a cornerstone, IP protection as a cornerstone, and data sharing around this as a blueprint. So I'm happy about that. That have shown to work well. I think where we don't have a blueprint, but maybe could look for best practices is what Robert just spoke to around capacity building and dose sharing. I think we find examples globally on what not to do, but we also find good examples on what to do. So I think we can examine that area a bit thorough and really distill best practices. My third comment would be something that is not really discussed, where I don't think we have a blueprint or best practice at all. That is building trust to the vaccines that are actually developed. So, I mean, we have discussed how rapid we can accelerate the innovation and bring them out globally. But what we are really facing right now is a lack of trust in that the vaccine that we're putting forward are actually working, and people have distrust in these vaccines. So we see in many countries that even though you have the doses sitting on the shelf, a major proportion of the population are not willing to take the vaccines because the lack of trust. So what I'm really where I want to focus is how do we build trust in the vaccines that we have brought forward? Because we will not get to herd immunity if people are not ready to take the vaccines. And that is a big problem, as I see it, on top of dose sharing and capacity building that is not being discussed. And this trust building, that starts from the very, very start, when we as researchers start to highlight the technology, but also the politicians and the governments and the NGOs can be part of building trust in the medicines that we are providing. And there we lack a big blueprint for what to do, because I think this will hit us severely in the future when we have sort of global availability of vaccines, but we'll see a large proportion of the population not taking the vaccines. So that's where I would sort of start to put my money in building trust around the vaccinations that we are putting forward.
It's a great point, Lars, and I think many would actually argue that the vaccines are just kind of the thin end of the wedge about building broader public trust in health technologies and therapeutics, regardless of condition area. Amy, let me come to you next, because this is something that I think you also think about a lot at WIPO. I mean, intellectual property, technology ownership, this goes beyond the patent. Right? It is about public trust in the use of technologies and what's made available and how reliable they are. So what would be your thoughts on that after what Lars has just said?
Yeah, you know, it's really fascinating. I think I want to thank Lars for bringing in this notion of trust, because I would say it's, yeah, spot on, Lars, absolutely, with the vaccine confidence, but I think it's even broader. And it's like trust in governments, trust in global cooperation, trust in UN entities, and, trust that the global IP system, which was conceived by the 193 member states of WIPO, trust that when those member states were negotiating what the global IP system would do, that they had good things in mind. I think it's this fascinating, it's almost like an endemic societal breakdown of trust. And there's multi-layers. And I think that's another fascinating thing that the COVID pandemic has really ripped it open and exposed it raw, how many different levels and layers just suffer from this endemic lack of trust. And it's like you see it like between people, you see it between institutions, you see it between public and private. And it's fascinating because it reminds us that at the end of the day, we are all human, and we are grounded in very human ways of interpreting and feeling and experiencing things. And if we neglect to address this very soft side, this very human side, and if we are focusing only on the hard scientific side, we could have the best science in the world, and we still won't have the outcome that we want or need.
Great, thank you very much for that. So I suggest we actually move from here to our final main theme, which is about
May I just jump on this governance question? Because
sure,
it's something which I was triggered by Amy and by Lars, because I couldn't agree more. But I think one of the mistakes which was made in the early days is that the governance was mainly composed of government officials and medical doctors. And there were no broad representation of society. There were no artists involved, musicians involved, patient organizations involved. And I think that is something which, at least certainly on your question regarding governance on such situations, that we really have to make sure that from day one, it's an all-inclusive process. And it's not the government and then medical doctors who are in the governance more or less deciding what will happen. It's essential that there's a buy-in from society. And that means that you have to put in the governance representatives from society, even people who are not at all specialized in the medical field. So that they know they are involved and they can participate, and they can also say what is on their mind, what is their worry. So from that point of view, I just want to bring that forward, so that governance should be all-inclusive. But I see Lars and Amy nodding, so that means that we're on the same page, and Rachel as well.
Okay, well, let's move from there, Robert. We'll stay with you, because I wanted to talk in the last sort of 8-10 minutes about partnerships. Because you, of course, when you were at the Commission, had a significant role to play in developing the model of public-private partnerships. in areas such as the Innovative Medicines Initiative and beyond. And I think there's a broad recognition that PPPs are a great tool to stimulate, pre-competitive cross-border research and development partnerships, but they need stable policy support, funding, and clear goals. And so I wonder, if you take a step back from what Europe is doing and what you see elsewhere in the world, are the current models of partnership fit for purpose based on what we've experienced in the last 18 months or so?
Well, I'm, as you know, and you mentioned already, a very strong believer in the power of public-private partnerships. And I've seen it indeed in the European context. Innovative Medicines, a fantastic public-private partnership already existing for 13 years between Big Pharma and the European Commission. Not easy to set up, but functioning extremely well. If you look at it, there have been over the 13 years an approved vaccine developed for Ebola, insights into the genetics of Alzheimer, and there was a new classification of diabetes. So this is really a fantastic tool, bringing the best from the public and the private sector together. Now, was it easy? Absolutely not. I remember in the early days, again, a matter of trust, how to find trust, how to build up trust, how to agree on a common agenda. Of course, for many big pharma industries, it was mainly Me Too drugs. Well, of course, for the public side, it is the World Health Organization's priorities. The governance situation was discussed, commitment. How do you find commitment? But I must say that over those 13 years, IMI has become really a success story. And now they are entering into a new phase. I think the European Commission made a fantastic proposal of widening, opening the system, bringing also in diagnostic companies and biotechnology companies. So it's really now becoming all-inclusive, much more transparent procedures. So from that point of view, the PPP model, as I have seen it functioning over the last years, was difficult to establish, but it functions quite well. And now it's a matter of indeed allowing other players to come in, allowing also funding agencies like the Gates Foundation to come in and to be actively involved, and to be also much more transparent with regards to procedures. I remember quite well when the Ebola crisis started, how within 3 weeks' time, we were able to generate in Europe, thanks to the European Commission and Big Pharma, 250 million, and immediately could start clinical trials, which was unheard of. And it was just possible because there was this trust built over years. So yes, Simon, I believe in this tool, PPPs, and I can only recommend it to all continents to really take this as the model to also address the other grand societal challenges we are facing.
Thank you, Robert Jan. So in line with this, a related question to Rachel and to Lars, and then we'll keep the final question for Amy before we wrap. So Rachel, Lars, in the existing models of partnership for research technology development, and when we think about what will come next in other condition areas, other therapeutic domains, do you think we need to redesign our approaches to R&D? Do you think we need a new model? Rachel, you're muted if you just activate your microphone.
Thank you, Simon. I think that we have seen partnerships, public-private partnerships that are working for the crisis right now. The reason why we on Africa can have these hubs where we can get vaccine product is because of those partnerships between the public and the private sector. But when we look at the future, which is where we were talking about those future strategic capabilities, I think that we will always need the public-private partnerships, because production, I think, of manufacture of products that are relevant to dealing with chronic disease and pandemics of the future has a lot to do with the ability of the private sector to actually deliver products into markets. But they need to do that, and they can only do that in a space where the environment, the policy environment, is enabling. So when you say we need to redesign this, I think that we have had an opportunity because of this crisis to look at the gaps in the policy frameworks across the whole system, a system's view of what's working and what's not. And so if redesigning is talking to how then do we address the gaps that we have seen as exposed by this pandemic, absolutely we have sight of what some of those gaps are and we can address them. But Simon, there is one quick thing that I wanted to put forward. When you spoke about the blueprint of the future, and there was the issue of trust and vaccine hesitancy, I thought it depends on the lens of who is talking. You're talking about vaccine hesitancy where there is vaccine on the shelf. Where I come from, we are some of the least vaccinated populations in low and middle income countries. And so the question is, do we have a blueprint? I think that blueprint is still evolving because there is that stark difference between with respect to access to the vaccine and then the weaknesses associated, of course, with the health system. And the blueprint has to be really very thorough, rigorous, and inclusive of the full system beyond access to the product itself. So I just wanted to add that from the previous debate.
I'm delighted that you did, Rachel. In fact, it's a good enough topic for an entire other event or conference. But Lars, let me pass to you now for your closing thoughts on this question of the new models going forward.
Yeah, but I mean, I have very little to add on top of Robert and Rachel's comments. But I mean, let me build on Rachel's comment that we're forced to have more a system view on how we want to treat disease. And I think the redesign for all of us is to get a more holistic view on our patients globally. That is where we really have to work hard, and having a systems view on this and also a holistic picture of our patients. So it's not just about providing, it is about providing the medicines, but also taking the holistic view on how to do that and how to put the patient in the center of what we're doing at a global scale. So it's not a small thing.
It most certainly isn't. Thank you, Lars. So Amy, the final question for you for the last minute, 90 seconds that we have. Are you optimistic or pessimistic that what Lars, Rachel and Robert Jan have said can be done? Can we take this systems view, holistic view at a global scale?
So Simon, you know, this is really rare for me to say, but I'm optimistic because I have to be, because we have to do it. I mean, there's no other, you know, there's no other way. The pressure is on. I mean, it's go time, you know, and you know, when I think about the systems view, and you know, if you think about how systems are built and the fact that you usually have bureaucrats sitting around a table deciding what this is going to look like to various degrees of consultation, you know, to Robert Jan's point earlier, we have to let more people in the room. We have to have more viewpoints present. We have to be more inclusive. And, you know, it's interesting. And I also want to tie this into the point on the public-private partnerships, because I run two of them at WIPO. One of them is around drug discovery for NTDs, malaria, and tuberculosis. And it's all about working with pharmaceutical companies who will share their unused IP and their unused compounds and let NGOs and universities screen them for anti-NTD properties. And then I also run a PPP all around climate change, which is all about connecting those who develop green technologies with those who are seeking the green technologies. You know, and I think the lessons that we learn from the PPPs, where you're bringing everybody, you're bringing in industry and NGO and researchers and universities, and you're bringing UN institutions, at least in my case, you know, and first of all, the main thread running through everything is expectations versus resourcing. If we need something to work, if it really has to work and our expectations are sky high that it has to work, we have to resource it properly, which means we have got to check, does everybody have what they need? Does everybody who should be there, are they there? And are we effectively supporting this? And I think we can't talk about resourcing without talking again about trust. Because you can't resource something, you can't believe in it, you can't invest in it, you can't really cheer for it unless you have trust. So again, the openness, the transparency, the everybody do what they can, we don't all have the same niche, and thank God we don't. But that means that we have to work together, and that means that we have to trust that the other agencies or individuals or entities or companies that occupy a niche that we don't occupy, we have to trust them.
Well, on that optimistic note, I'd like to draw the discussion to a close. It's been a fascinating experience to have the four of you with us from different parts of Europe and Africa. Thank you so much for taking the time. To Rachel, to Lars, to Amy and to Robert Jan, we wish you much success in your future endeavours, and we look forward to having you back with us at some point to talk more about health tech, climate tech, or whatever the case may be. But thank you very much for joining us today. And with that, I would now like to pass the stage back to Marion, our CEO, who will transition us into the networking session and beyond. Marion.
Thank you, Simon, and a warm thank you to all your panelists, and thank you for ending this fascinating discussion on a note of optimism, really. So we are going to break in 1 minute for networking and coffee, and before we do so, I'd just like to get just 1 more minute of your attention, because I'd like to share a small video just to present to the entire audience the latest publication of Science Business. So bear with us, and can we please launch the short video?
Horizon Europe is underway. Europe's biggest R&D program, nearly 100 billion in funding for researchers and entrepreneurs across Europe and beyond. How does the program work? How do you get funding out of it? For these and other questions, you can find the answers in the Science Business Guide to Horizon Europe. Go to our website, download the report, read it, use it, and speed your research project along.
Now it's time for coffee. So we will be back in about 20 minutes for the last health-focused session. Stay on the platform. You have the meeting hub there. You have also the networking session right in front of you. Go there. It's just like entering a coffee room, a coffee break in a normal conference, but without knowing who you will meet at the coffee table. Well, that's how it's going to work. You will meet randomly selected people, enjoy it. It's actually fun, and we look forward to seeing you again here in 20 minutes.